It's now 9.5 months since Israel began a brutal military campaign and near-total siege on Gaza, after Hamas, the Palestinian political party and militant group, launched a deadly raid into Israel on the 7th of October. The numbers of dead, displaced and injured have increased since this podcast was originally published on the 9th of November 2023. But the issues in this podcast remain the same.
Today on What's Unsaid, peace in Gaza.
As a Palestinian, when you work in peace, your community looks at you and calls you a normalizer. Or if you are an Israeli and you work in peace, your community looks at you and calls you a lefty or a traitor in some cases.
How do you find common ground when even words like ceasefire or peace have become loaded terms? Hamas militants killed 1,400 people in Israel in their October 7th attacks, according to Israeli authorities. Israel's siege of Gaza has struck hospitals, schools, entire neighborhoods, and claimed the lives of 10,000 people and counting, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza. A humanitarian catastrophe is worsening. One peace activist says Palestinians and Israelis are both grieving, but in what feels like vastly different conversations. Communities see the violence through the lens of their collective trauma. For Israelis, the October 7th attacks evoke memories of the Holocaust. For Palestinians, violent mass displacement in Gaza feels like another Nakba or catastrophe, when 700,000 people were expelled from their land in 1948. How do you bridge this divide? How do you start to talk about peace again when the bombs are still falling? This is What's Unsaid, a bi-weekly podcast by the New Humanitarian, where we explore open secrets and uncomfortable conversations around the world's conflicts and disasters. My name is Irwin Loy, staff editor at the New Humanitarian. On today's episode, Peace in Gaza. Joining us today is Nivine Sandouka. She lives in East Jerusalem and works with the Alliance for Middle East Peace, a coalition of 170 organizations trying to build cooperation among Israelis and Palestinians. Nivine, this is a really difficult time for everyone, including peace activists. How would you describe the atmosphere right now?
So basically, it wasn't the best period for peace building even before the 7th of October, because the field itself, if you look at it, it's mostly underfunded. We face also challenges from our own communities. As Palestinian, when you work in peace, your community looks at you and calls you a normalizer. Or if you are an Israeli and you work in peace, your community looks at you and calls you a lefty or a traitor in some cases. So you can only imagine what it means right now after the 7th of October for the peace building camp. And we are seeing that our members are stepping up and they understand that right now they need to do work with our own communities. We need to be holding our communities together. In Palestine, for example, the Palestinian members are stepping up to do humanitarian assistance. The Israeli members and the Shared Society members are coming together to basically also offer assistance. Each one of those organizations are going back to their communities, but we do understand this is also a critical moment. Now we feel that our work is mostly needed. We feel that we need to review our approaches. And I have to tell you, the best approach that has so far proven to be a little bit easier for members to come together are those organizations who have actually spoken a lot about identity issues, who have spoken a lot about the narratives. So, for example, for an Israeli who spoke and understand the narrative of a Palestinian, they will understand what a Nakba is, or the catastrophe for the Palestinians in 1948. For a Palestinian who understood the Jewish-Israeli narrative, they will understand the 7th of October event brings back the memory of the Holocaust. So there's a first level of understanding, and from there, you can build on future work as well.
Now, you talked about how difficult it was to work on peace even before the 7th of October, and now we're seeing a really challenging situation. Do you think that advocating for peace is becoming a taboo subject?
When you mention the word peace, sometimes in your community, it comes with such a disappointment because people link it in their head with the peace process that already happened in Oslo in the 90s. And that did not lead to actual peace. It did not lead for an independent state for the Palestinians or for security for the Israelis. So they kind of are really skeptical when you mention the word peace. For the younger generation, they didn't even witness an Oslo moment. So for them, they grew up already in a very hostile situation with separation wall running between the two communities, with checkpoints, with increasing fear of one another, with decreasing opportunities to meet with one another. And so when you tell the younger generation the word peace, they're going to look at you and they wouldn't understand what it means. But as I always say, the devil's in the details. When you start talking a little bit more about what the word peace actually means, it is security, it is acknowledgement, it is the acknowledgement of each other's narratives, the right to exist, human rights. People start to kind of feel, yes, we relate to that. We want it for ourselves, but also we want it for the other. We need to understand what the word peace is. And right now, today, the word peace starts with a ceasefire.
I just want to get a sense of the different viewpoints coming in here. It seems like people are living in two separate bubbles when it comes to viewing even all the events since the 7th of October. There are different echo chambers that affect how people view what's happening. Can you talk a little bit about the differences in what Israelis might hear in their media versus what Palestinians are getting about the same violence?
Media is a tool that can be easily used by your government to trap you or to control what you think and what you feel towards the other. So when I asked my Israeli Jewish friends, what are they watching? What are they seeing on their media channels? And they were like, we're watching the local media channels, the mainstream talk shows, news. Of course, they have like an emergency, broadcasting happening. I see those as well. First of all, there's not a single Palestinian voice in these talk shows. Not even a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship that is hosted to speak. None. Are the Israeli public aware of what's happening in Gaza? And the answer is no. The mainstream media seems to be controlling its people into reliving the moment of the 7th of October, which I understand from an Israeli perspective, it brings back the trauma of the Holocaust. It's a collective trauma, and the reaction is expected. But to use it as a method of control of your people to achieve your aims, that is something different. If you look at the Palestinians and if you look at the Arab world, we are seeing other videos on social media, for example, when they had connection. People from Gaza started, to broadcast videos of what was going on. Another media channel is Al Jazeera that has live broadcasting 24/7 from Gaza City. So the Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world are seeing something totally different from what the Israelis are seeing. And at the same time, we are hearing in the news constantly reports and the leaked document recently about displacement of the Palestinians. And this brings us back to the time of our own Nakba and our own 1948 catastrophe. So we also have this collective trauma all of a sudden that, oh my God, it's Nakba all over again. And we're stuck in that moment. So you have two people with two collective traumas. Both sides are being controlled and both sides are fearing one another. There is a huge amount of fear. And from fear comes this aggression, comes this, you cannot talk, you cannot criticize, you cannot say anything. It's just a total, disconnect, simply because each people are saying something else.
I'm struck by your recognizing of the collective trauma of two communities. I think that takes a great deal of empathy to recognize the collective trauma in both communities. So branching off from that, I'm wondering, when you think about your Israeli friends, your Israeli colleagues, peace activists, or whomever, what do you share in common? What is there to build on?
So first of all, let me say that we have victims, if I can use that word, but we do have victims from both sides of this who are paying the highest price. So we have a peace activist, a founder of a big feminist movement in Israel that calls for peace. She's taken as a hostage in Gaza. We do have alumni who participated in peace-building activities, who's also taken as hostages in Gaza, but are also living in Gaza. So you have peace builders on both sides who are finding themselves, at the forefront of this and paying the highest price. Not everybody understood what was going on the other side. For a Palestinian peace builder, what happened on the 7th of October, and I'm not justifying it, I'm just trying to explain how some people might see it. What happened to the Israeli Jewish public on the 7th of October is something that the Palestinians have witnessed over and over and over in Jenin, in Nablus, in Jerusalem, in Gaza. For an Israeli Jewish person, this is the first time that this happens to them. For a Palestinian, we're so used to this. So it really takes a lot of thinking and analysis to understand what it means to be an Israeli Jew, to have been attacked in that way, and to lose 1,400 persons. And at the same time, for the Israelis, because they don't see the media, because there is a lack of communication with one another, I think they don't really understand that we are hearing all the time the word Nakba and the word displacement. A peace builder unfortunately told me that, so what? Let them go to Egypt for a month and then they can come back. And me, as a peace builder, when I heard that, I panicked. Because I was like, no, this happened exactly the same scenario, happened in 1948, and we still have refugees all over the world, and we still don't have a solution for them. You cannot, as a peace builder, come and tell me, let them go to Egypt. You cannot. That means that you basically don't understand the very basic level of the trauma of one another. But right now, I think more and more Israeli peace builders, what is happening is that I see there's more sympathy for the ones who are trying to get more news and trying to understand what is really happening in Gaza. There are constant calls and demonstrations for the release of the hostages. And the release of hostages, they understand it's not going to happen through war, which means ultimately a ceasefire, and which means ultimately that you need to go through a negotiation process.
When people call for a ceasefire in Israel, among Palestinians, how is that viewed?
In Israel in general, and I'm not talking about the peace-building camp. So when you talk about a ceasefire, it means that, no, we did not get rid of Hamas. Hamas is going to be stronger. We need to get rid of them. And so when you say the word ceasefire, it is not welcomed at all. The majority of the Israeli public these days. But right now for the Palestinians, this is the only thing that we want. Of course, in addition to a humanitarian corridor, in addition to the protection of civilians, but it's because you're feeling extremely helpless and hopeless. If you are a Palestinian with an Israeli citizenship, you cannot basically criticize, you cannot express your emotions with what is happening in Gaza. You cannot express sympathy with people from Gaza. You cannot share pictures that are coming out from Gaza. We cannot express our identity. But the ceasefire is definitely what we're asking for. And again, that's another huge gap between the Israelis and the Palestinians right now.
You spoke earlier about the collective trauma of Israelis and the collective trauma of Palestinians. There's such a wide gap between the two, but it's about recognizing those starting points, right? So how do you begin to build trust now between Palestinians and Israelis? Where do you start?
That's a very good point. To tell you the truth, it's also a very difficult question. We are seeing Palestinians and Israelis, Palestinians with an Israeli citizenship and Israeli Jewish community, members of the Alliance for Middle East Peace and non-members are coming up together to provide emergency assistance. You see them working together. Even though there are many, many restrictions on the Palestinians with an Israeli citizenship, on the things they say, on the things they do. But these examples, when you see a Palestinian with an Israeli citizenship and an Israeli Jew come together and they understand that we are all in the same boat together, it gives you hope. And it gives you a basic level of understanding. And then you see the same person, Palestinian with an Israeli citizenship. They also understand exactly what is happening with the Palestinians from the West Bank and the Palestinians from Gaza and the Palestinians from Jerusalem. And they're able to take all of that and narrate it to the Israeli Jew. So somehow we can start from there. We can start to finding a middle point that understands the traumas and the narratives of the both sides, the bridge to communicate what is happening to each side. So that's one aspect. The other thing is we have also members at the Alliance for Middle East Peace who work cross-border. And right now they're bringing the Palestinians staff with the Israeli Jewish staff to talk, to have dialogue, to ask the difficult questions, to ask, why are we here today? Where did we go wrong? And what do we need to do for the future? And that, I think, is a very basic step as well. And as peace builders, we are definitely going to build on all of these good points and consider those as a starting point towards developing future approaches. But one very main thing that we're also doing at the Alliance for Middle East Peace is not only working at the level of the grassroots here with our members, we're also doing a lot of advocacy to basically say, we need the protection of civilians, we need the immediate release of hostages, we need the humanitarian corridor, and ultimately, this cannot go on. We need a multilateral peace process where not only the United States are part in, European countries, Arab countries, but we do need to have that multilateral peace process as well going on. Because otherwise, what happened on the 7th of October is going to repeat itself over and over again.
You know, many of our readers at the New Humanitarian and our listeners for What's Unsaid work in the aid sector, specifically the emergency aid sector. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on what humanitarian organizations should keep in mind when they're talking about working on this current crisis. What can they do that might contribute toward peace?
First of all, I would like to thank them for everything that they do. They've done enormous work. I am specifically following Oxfam's work as an aid organization. And I think what they need to remember is to keep doing also advocacy that is focused on both sides. For example, Oxfam, again, specifically because I'm following them, they're calling that all human lives are sacred, the protection of all civilians, the need for a ceasefire, the need for peaceful negotiations. And I think this is what humanitarian agencies need to talk about all the time, not just let's go in and do humanitarian aid, which is crucial and important, but it's not enough. You also need to be vocal about, we don't want this to happen again. And in order for this not to happen again, we need to understand and we need to push for negotiations and we need to find a solution. I think this is what they need to remember. And at the same time, there was a debate earlier on going before the 7th of October that basically said there is a difference between peace building and human rights. And it's like two different sectors. But right now, I think what we're saying is that they're so intertwined, they're dovetailed together. You cannot talk the language of human rights without talking why you need those human rights and how you're going to protect those human rights, which is exactly peace building. And you cannot talk about peace building without understanding what kind of peace you actually mean, which is exactly the human rights that you want to achieve in order to achieve peace. So these are the simple messages, and I hope they're going to review their approaches and include a little bit more of the language of peace building and a call for negotiations.
Can you talk about your vision for peace? What does peace look like to you?
I would love to live in a place where I know I'm secure, where I know that my identity is celebrated. My identity is not a threat to the other person. My identity as a Palestinian, my identity as a woman, my identity as a mother, it's not a threat to anybody. And people respect that and give me the space to practice my identity, to be who I want to be. It also means for me that, everybody is able to enjoy human rights. It should be equal human rights, equal voting rights, equal, accessibility to resources, equality, simply security. I have a son who is 13 years old, and it breaks my heart that he's unable to go outside and play because, we're afraid in Jerusalem that something might happen to him, either police violence or extremists can attack him. It breaks my heart that a 13-year-old boy needs to go through this. You cannot go to the movies, you cannot go out to a restaurant, you cannot even go out and play football safely. And these are the things that, I want to give for my son in a sense of a normal life. And that sense of normal life is what peace means to me.
You have such a tough job right now. I'm wondering what drives you to keep pushing for peace. Maybe that's obvious, but what gives you hope that it could actually happen?
I'm 41 years old. So it means that I was born in the 80s, and I witnessed the very first uprising between Palestinians and the Israelis. So in school, as a young child, I basically remember how Israeli forces used to come into my school. We as little kids trying to hide under the benches. You smell the tear gas in Jerusalem. Some of my neighbors were shot and killed right in front of my eyes. And then from that violence and from that fear, you suddenly see both of the leaders, the Israeli Jewish leader and a Palestinian leader, shaking hands with one another, putting down their weapons. And basically, there's a symbol, a new symbol, a peace dove that carries, the olive branch. And I remember when they signed that agreement, we went out to the streets as Palestinians to celebrate. It was like an euphoria to kind of like recognize that, wow, finally we're going to have our state. We're going to have our own, identity card. We're going to be talking in our language. We're going to be neighbors. And you see the relationships, and you see, Israeli Jews come into the Palestinian neighborhoods to do shopping and vice versa. People started unlearning each other's languages, and then the extremists hijacked it again. And ever since, we didn't have another peaceful process. So I guess what gives me hope to continue and to know that this is possible is that I have witnessed this moment. It is possible. We just need to, first of all, have the people demanding that change, but at the same time, we need to have the leadership from both sides that is willing to say, let's make a difficult decision and let's go for peace.
Nivine, thank you for sharing your views on the next steps for peace and for joining us today on the What's Unsaid podcast.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Nivine Sandouka is a Palestinian peace activist from East Jerusalem. She works with the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Visit thenewhumanitarian.org for ongoing reporting on the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the region. And stay tuned for next week's Rethinking Humanitarianism episode, which examines the long-term impacts of aid on Palestinians and whether humanitarians should be pushing for an end to Israeli occupation. What are people afraid to talk about in today's crises? What needs to be discussed openly? Let us know. Send us an email, podcast@thenewhumanitarian.org. Subscribe to The New Humanitarian on your podcast app for more episodes of What's Unsaid, our new podcast about open secrets and uncomfortable conversations, with new episodes every other week, hosted by Ali Latifi and me. This episode is produced and edited by Martha Vanderwolf, with sound engineering by Mark Nieto, and original music by Whitney Patterson. It's hosted by me, Irwin Loy.